So I am really delighted to be here with these distinguished panelists for our panel, Demythologizing China in the World. And this, just a little background. So my name's Diana Greenwald. I'm in the political science department. And I started discussing an idea to bring in maybe one guest speaker to speak about China's contemporary role in geopolitics with my colleagues Raphael Kahn and Dirk Moses and Larry Au, and then we were able to really grow this into a full-fledged embarrassment of riches in terms of expertise on today's panel. So I really wanted to thank my colleagues, Raphael Kahn, who is seated at the table here, and my colleague Larry Au in sociology for moderating this event, and also wanted to thank the Political Science Department, Department Chair Dan DeSalvo, who's supporting the event. I wanted to thank my colleague Dirk Moses, the Spitzer Chair in International Relations, for his support, and also the Colin Powell School. In addition, our wonderful staff, Jennifer Roman and Danielle Hilla at the Colin Powell School, for all of their support today. I'm realizing I forgot my little... I am actually going to, before we introduce our wonderful panel, hand things over to my colleague Larry Au, who's one of our moderators today. So Larry is an assistant professor in the sociology department here at the Colin Powell School, and his research examines the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion in the production of biomedical knowledge, and asks how clinicians and scientists can better serve their patient and the public. But much of this work has been looking at the globalization of medicine and has focused on its rise and the rise of big data in medicine in China in particular. So his expertise on the politics of biomedicine and on issues such as long COVID is very timely. And then our other moderator, who will be speaking right after Larry, is Raphael Kahn. Professor Kahn is an assistant professor here in the political science department, and is also an associate at the Harvard Asia Center. And her work lies at the intersection of international history and international relations, focusing on the international politics of South Asia, both from a historical and a contemporary lens. So widely published in Asian studies and international history journals as well, and has written on India and India's foreign policy. So I will leave the introductions there, and then my colleagues will introduce the rest of our panelists, and we'll get started. So thank you.
Is this on? All right. Yeah, no, thank you all for coming here today, and welcome to all the world politics students as well too. And I think if you're sitting in this room and if you're a student of world politics, you don't probably need convincing as to China matters to the world, right? But I think how China matters to the world merits a little bit more elaboration from the rest of our panelists. So one of the ways in which we can think about China mattering to the world is that it matters at a very grand scale, right? China is a massive country. It has 1.4 billion people. It is on the way to being the second largest country in the world, recently overtaken by India. It's also a very large economy. It is the second largest economy in the world, behind the United States, accounting for about 20% of world economic production, about $17 trillion in GDP. But China also plays increasingly pivotal roles in world affairs. And it is very important in a lot of different issues that matters for us here in the United States, but also for folks around the world. When it comes to things like climate change, China is the largest carbon emitter, emitting about 30% of all CO2 in 2019. So any types of responses to problems like climate change involves thinking about China's role in these efforts to combat climate change. China also plays an increasing role in shaping regional and international peace. Here, thinking about issues such as Taiwan, their recent phone calls with presidents in Ukraine. So China is increasingly important in international affairs. But China also matters for those of us sitting here in a very much more interpersonal, on a very much more day-to-day way. All of us buy and use products that are made in China, from our iPhones to clothing to other items that we see in grocery stores and in Walmarts. And all of us also interact with technology products that are made in China that are produced by Chinese developers, produced by Chinese companies, such as TikTok that we saw very recently on display in the United States. So hopefully you all understand and appreciate that China matters. So when Diana, Dirk, Raphael, and I were talking about this panel, we're thinking about what to call it. We thought about calling it China in the World. It seemed a little bit short. We're thinking about demystifying China, but that seemed a little bit too orientalizing, and China isn't really too much of a mystery for those of us seated here who study China and interact with our Chinese colleagues. So we came to the title of demythologizing China. So thinking about how concepts that we see in academia, in public, in policy spheres sometimes do help us, but also sometimes hinder us in understanding what China is, how it behaves, and how it acts on a world stage. And yeah, there's a lot of concepts that we can use to think about how China interacts with the world, from great power politics to the Cold War, thinking about how they interact with the United States and other major world powers around the world, and also ideas like empire, imperialism, perhaps neocolonialism, and thinking about how it interacts with other states in Latin America, in Africa, and its border regions. And hopefully our panelists will help us think through these concepts and be able to help us see if there's any utility in these ideas and thinking about China. So I already talked enough, so I'll hand it over to my colleague, Professor Raphael Khan, who will give us an overview about the structure for today's events and introduce our fabulous speakers.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to present a very distinguished panel of speakers who has the particularity of being multidisciplinary, both historians and political scientists and sociologists. And we're all major experts on China. So from the left to the right, we have Professor Arnie Westad, who's LU Professor of History at Yale University, and who previously taught at the LSE in London and at Harvard, and who is also a fellow of the British Academy and other national academies. And Professor Westad has published 16 books, most of which deals with 20th century Asian and global history, including Cold War and Revolution, Decisive Encounters, The Global Cold War, which argues for ways of understanding the Soviet-American conflict in light of late and post-colonial changes in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. He also wrote Restless Empire, which discusses broad trends in China's international history and the Cold War world history. And he's currently mainly interested in researching histories of empire and imperialism. Then we have Naima Green-Riley, who is an incoming assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University, and who's also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, a member of the board of directors of Oxfam America, and a member of the advisory board of Foreign Policy for America, and who, before entering academia, was a foreign service officer at the US Department of State. Naima's work has focused on US and China's foreign policy with a focus on public diplomacy and global information spaces. And her book project focuses on US and Chinese public diplomacy, comparing these two models. Her forthcoming book, The China Questions 2, is going to be published at Harvard University Press. Then we have Professor Tan Sen, who is director of the Center for Global Asia and professor of history at NYU Shanghai, and who's also the author of many books, including Buddhism, Diplomacy and Trade, The Realignment of Sino-Indian Relations, India, China and the World, A Connected History, many co-authored books as well. He's currently working a book on Senhi's, I'm probably pronouncing that wrongly. I'm an India scholar, so pardon me for the maritime expeditions in the early 15th century. And he was a founding head of the Nalanda Center in Singapore and served on the governing board of Nalanda University. And last but not least, we have Dr. Abigail Coplin, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology, Science and Technology at Vassar College, and whose work focuses on science, technology and nationalism in contemporary India. And her currently book project on domesticated biotechnological innovation, science, market and the state in post-socialist China demonstrates how interregional dynamics and legitimacy struggles drive China's distinctive trajectory of knowledge economic development. So really a very, very exciting panel here. Thank you very much for being here. And so each panelist is going to have 10-12 minutes to present on China, and then Larry and I will start the conversation by asking 2 questions, and then we'll open up the floor for the Q&A. Thank you very much. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Raphael. Is this one on? Yeah. Thank you very much, Raphael. Thanks to the others for putting this together. It's great to be back at CUNY. My first post-pandemic visit. I've been here before. I got lost in your corridors at least once, if not twice, without finding the room I was supposed to go to. This time it was easier. I was guided in the right direction. So I'm going to spend my time right at the beginning to talk about some of the prompts that we were given in terms of understanding China in a broader sense. I think the title for this panel is extremely well chosen. I think demythologizing China is exactly what we need to do, and particularly since we're sitting in the United States of America, we need to do it from here, as we need to demythologize many other things that we need to think hard about in a US context. So the first prompt I'm going to pick up on, which I think is really well chosen, is the prompt of empire and the significance that empire has with regard to understanding the relationship between the United States and China. And I think that's exactly, again, the right term to use. This is in many ways a clash of empires. Very different empires, but still countries that behave in, for someone who's a historical student of empire, in very recognizable imperial ways. And that, of course, also tells us something about the significance of the clash between the two. This is not just something that is going to have an impact on Americans and Chinese. As all clashes of empire throughout history, it's also going to have a big impact on people elsewhere. And particularly since these are now the 2 predominant empires, I think, in global affairs overall. And I'm really worried about this. I was in Beijing for my first post-COVID visit about 3 weeks ago. And it was wonderful to be back there. It's a country that I know well and love. It's a country where I spent a lot of time. I first came there as a 19-year-old sophomore in 1979 for a year's exchange program and started picking up the language and started studying China. And that's an ongoing process, both in terms of the language and in terms of studying China. So I enjoyed the food, I enjoyed seeing old friends, but it also left me profoundly depressed in terms of the relationship between the United States and China and what is happening domestically within China. To put it very briefly, China is far more repressive, far more dominated by surveillance in all of its forms than when I last lived there in 2019. I spent about half a year living in Beijing in 2019, and that's worrisome. What's even more worrisome to me as a non-Chinese is that it seems that quite a number of people at higher levels within China are really worried that there will be a war between the United States and China. Not a Cold War. I mean, the Cold War moniker for this, and some of you will know that I've written about this, I think is thoroughly misplaced. This doesn't look anything like the Cold War of the late 20th century. It looks much more, as I already said, as the clash between empires in the late 19th and early 20th century. And as many of you who are historically minded here will know, that's not good news, right? The Cold War, after all, ended in most places relatively peacefully. The late 19th century imperial rivalries did not, right? So that's something that we have to take into consideration, something that for me overshadows everything else at the moment in terms of the study of China. I think we have to understand that there are very, very few people in China who want a war, even those who are most opposed to splitting off, as they would see, Taiwan from the mainland, or believe that the United States has a long-term plan to contain and defeat China without war. Even among those, I think there are very few people who actually want the military conflict between the United States and China. And we should do everything that we can in this country and in China to prevent that. Because if it first starts, it is very, very difficult to know where it's going to end. And this idea of war by proxy that we sort of got used to in the Cold War, and we're seeing now to some extent in Ukraine, that is not going to be the situation if there is a war over Taiwan, or if there is a meltdown in Korea or elsewhere within the region that can lead to a direct confrontation between the United States and China. So that's my first point. My second point, also taken from the prompts, is about nationalism. So as many of you will know, nationalisms do not sit easily with empires. Right? Usually nationalisms, both in Asian and European empires, are among the trends of thought that defeat empires, that go against imperial frameworks, because it's very hard to be a nation state and an empire at the same time. Right? In spite of that, I feel that that's what China to some extent is trying to do today. I mean, it wants to have it both ways. It wants to be an empire in terms of controlling other people at its borders, and it wants to be a nation state. And it's easy to say that with what the Chinese now call the Han nationality, people that I call Chinese, being 93% of the population, it can look like a nation state, but it's not a nation state. It's the direct inheritor of the Qing Empire. If you look at the map of the Qing Empire from the early part of the 20th century and compare it to China today, there are some parts that have broken away, mainly for nationalist reasons. Mongolia, for instance, being the most striking one. But the rest of that map is remarkably similar to that of the Qing Empire. Right? While it still wants to define itself as a nation state. And of course in the United States, we see similar trends. We see people here, not just our former president, Donald Trump, but also others, who want to redefine the United States in very sort of nativist, nationalist directions. Right? With consequences that are going to be very problematic in terms of leading a foreign policy as an empire. So if you're an empire, recognize that you're an empire. It's much better than if you also try to behave as if you were a nation state, both domestically and internationally. We can discuss this later, but I think it's an important point. We were asked about whether one effect, not necessarily a desired effect, but one effect of current tensions between the United States and China would be some form of decoupling. I don't believe that for a minute. Both these countries operate under the logic of global capitalism, which was recreated in the form that we see now after the Cold War ended, or just as the Cold War ended. And I think the opportunities that are there with regard to capital are so significant that being able to break out of this, establishing in a way two rival capitalisms, is a very, very unlikely prospect. That's not the same thing as saying that states, United States maybe first and foremost, but also China, will try to do this. Right? They will attempt to do this. But I think they will attempt and fail. Right? Whether that's good or bad is something I'd really like to hear what my fellow panelists have to say something about. I mean, basically, not breaking up the fundamentals of capital, of capital expansion, or globalization, or whatever you want to call it, may be good. But on the other hand, if the United States sets out on that kind of trajectory and actually fails in doing so, what will then happen? Right? What is the next step if people actually believe that that kind of decoupling could be possible and find that it is not? Right? Another of the prompts to pick up on is what will happen domestically, or at least that's how I want to interpret the question. What will happen domestically in these two countries as a result of the increased rivalry or potential conflict between the two? And I think the answer to that is pretty clear. Nothing good will happen for either of them. I already referred to how shocked I was, even as someone who knows China well, at the level of surveillance that you now find, the level of control that you now find in China. And some of that, not all of it, but some of it is the result of the tension and conflict that now exists between China and the United States, as defined by the Chinese Communist Party. But I think quite a lot of people, even people who are relatively critical of the party, buy into this idea that China is now under such great pressure from the outside that it needs to show greater cohesion at home. That's not to say that people, applaud or even in the least agree with some of these idiotic measures of surveillance and being cut off from the rest of the world, the great firewall of China in internet terms. Those are irritants that people do not particularly like. But in terms of the overall framework, I think there is some understanding for this, and that troubles me. Likewise, on the US side, I mean, absolutely no doubt that as conflict with China intensifies, just like we saw in earlier great campaigns in the United States, pressure against dissent, against people who think differently, about people who want to represent different interests domestically in the United States is going to increase. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And then in conclusion, what is the most likely trend on this? So that's where I really have to be the bringer of bad news. I mean, I think the relationship between the United States and China is not going to get better anytime soon. I think it's more likely that it will get worse. I think we have to watch the issue of Taiwan, which I'm sure we'll get back to later on, but also other regional issues within Eastern Asia, which are the ones that really could lead to this going from rivalry and tension over onto direct conflict. So if we want to get a kind of weather vane of what the future will bring, I don't think we should look just or even primarily at bilateral relations between the United States and China. I think we should look at what happens within the Eastern Asian region, which both countries then will respond to in ways that could unfortunately lead to some kind of conflict. And we need to think about that now. We need to prepare for that now, particularly those of us who are very skeptical of the current direction taken in policy terms by both governments. Thank you.
Doing a few things to get ready. I don't trust myself with time, so I'm going to time myself. Just keep an eye on it. I think that was so great. I'm glad we chose this order because Arnie just gave us sort of a primer on where we stand right now with the U.S.-China relationship and really China's positionality in the world. And I kind of want to talk a bit about the U.S.-China relationship, but I want to talk about how we got here. I'll start by saying I'm a political scientist, and I'm most interested in the ways that ordinary people get caught up in world politics, right? So I'm not talking necessarily about leaders or diplomats or, elites, but how do we as normal people in the world find ourselves engaged in, paying attention to, and having opinions about things that are happening in the world? And so what's interesting to me is that when I first started focusing on that topic, I think that, U.S.-China relations, China in general, was just sort of one of another of many foreign policy topics that were kind of obscure to people. This is maybe like a decade ago, right? Like most people wouldn't necessarily focus on China in their everyday lives. And yet today, we find ourselves in a place where it would be hard to find someone in the U.S. who didn't know, what China was or where China was, and probably didn't have an opinion on it. I mean, most people encounter China somehow in the U.S. right now, and I think that that's interesting. But what I think is unfortunate is that we've also gotten to a place in our in the U.S.'s political relationship with China, where even when people don't necessarily know a great deal about the country or about the relationship between us, they often have very antagonistic views towards the other side. And that's not only a U.S. phenomenon, that's also a phenomenon in China. And so as someone who likes to think about these topics quite often, now I have to ask myself, how did we get to this point? And how did it get to the point that even when there hasn't necessarily been a point where both sides have gotten to know each other really well, we started to develop this popular enmity towards each other, and what does that mean? I am going to recommend a book by Kevin Rudd. He was, until very recently, the head of the Asia Society, but now has become the Australian ambassador to the US, so is here in the US doing something else. He's an Australian statesman, was the Prime Minister of Australia at one point, very, very focused on China for many years, speaks Chinese, and has written a lot about China's place in the world and the US and China. And he wrote in his book about the place that we find ourselves when it comes to US-China relations, and he wrote about how each side doesn't seem to be understanding each other. And here's an anecdote, this is a quote, where he was trying to give advice to sort of both the US and China on where they need to go if they don't want to erupt into this avoidable, but unfortunately possible conflict in the future. He said, as a first step, each side must be mindful of how their actions will be read by the other through the prism of their accumulated national perceptions. In other words, what buttons light up in the decision-making processes on one side when a particular action is taken by the other. At present, both sides are bad at this, often reflecting a combination of mutually assured non-comprehension and mirror imaging that has long characterized large parts of the US-China relationship. And the reason why I thought it was interesting to start with that is because I do think, from what I've heard of people who have gone recently to China, or from what I heard of meetings that have happened between US and Chinese elites right now, there seems to be almost like a level of jadedness in which each side doesn't really believe what the other side is saying, and each side isn't really willing to engage with goodwill with the other side because there's not even an ability to connect at the most basic level. So that's where we're starting from. How did we get here? I have a feeling that my long professorial lecture on US-China relations will not fit the very short time prompt that we have here, but I want to say a little bit about, I guess, sort of the trajectory till here. And a lot of people talk about China becoming a more assertive country, a country that has been more active in world affairs since the early 2000s. If you are a history buff or a recent history buff and you're interested in China's rise, an important year to take note of is 2008. That was the year of the global financial crisis. It was a surprising year for some because when the United States and many other countries were really hit hard by the financial crisis, China was able to offer a huge stimulus that actually buffered the global crisis from being worse, and certainly buffered things domestically in China. And that was an action that had a lot of follow-on effects. I think even Chinese leaders were impressed by the ability to be able to do that at a time when so many countries were struggling. And it served as somewhat of an indication that this country that, 30, 40 years ago was a very impoverished country had come very far. And that was something that people who paid attention to China knew, because China had seen a huge growth in its economy after 1978 and had brought a lot of people out of poverty. But that action in 2008 really substantiated how far the country had come. 2012 was when Xi Jinping became leader of China. Much has been written, much has been said about Xi. He is a leader that demands ultimate authority in Chinese decision-making in many ways, and a leader that seeks to create a sense of celebrity, I think, in the ways that he engages in Chinese politics. But around the 2010s, the United States decided to pivot towards Asia. So many of you may have heard this term of pivoting. And the main objective there was that the US had been engaged for, I guess a decade at that point in the Middle East primarily. It had been in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It had been pouring lots of money into these conflicts in the Middle East. And around the early 2010s, the Obama administration said we need to be explicit about paying more attention to Asia. Because in that region of the world, we're seeing China continue to grow in its power and its ability to make moves, the moves that it wants to economically or politically in ways that sometimes are coercive towards Southeast Asian nations, in terms of its engagement in maritime affairs or in, you may have heard about the South China Islands or the East China Islands disputes. China is starting to act in ways that we find troublesome and that also threaten the US's leadership in this region. And so with the pivot to Asia in 2009, 2010, 2011, you saw the United States starting to spend a lot more time thinking about China. But there was this overwhelming sense that had been there was a way of thinking within US elite circles that the US would be able, by being more engaged in the region, to really sort of hinder the troublesome actions by Chinese leadership. And there was also a belief that ultimately, there was a way to work with China. I think that in recent years, there's been more pessimism about those two beliefs. First of all, that the US can, through engagement, just sort of push back on the things that are troublesome about China in a way that will actually stop them. And also, sort of a lesser interest in engaging in the first place, a lesser interest in seeing huge areas of cooperation persist. During the time of the pivot, there was this initiative called the 100,000 Strong Initiative that was started by the Obama administration, and it was, the focus of it was to have young people study Chinese, study Mandarin Chinese. 100,000 Americans would study Chinese, and we'd have sort of this generation of people who would come to understand for whom China would be demystified. And we're now in a current era in which most of the people-to-people exchanges between the United States have been halted. So things like the Peace Corps program, opportunities for people to study abroad in China, even media exchanges or abilities of journalists to report on the other side, all have been sort of shut down in the wake of this increasing tension. How did we get to the point where we went from a thought that engaging with each other would be the way to go to a point where not engaging with each other and decoupling or moving away from each other was the right way forward? I think that many people around the world, and people in the United States especially, just sort of started to think, this is not what we expected. There was a long-standing belief by elites in the US for a while that not only that engagement would work, but that if China were integrated into the world, if China were engaged in world markets, if it were engaged with other countries politically, then that would mean that probably it would become more liberal, it would move towards democracy. I don't know if there was like this idea of a grand democratization, that it would become more integrated into the norms and to the values of other countries in the world. And I think that that belief is the thing that eroded the most in the turn towards a more aggressive stance towards China, which happened under the Trump administration, but with surprising levels of support from both parties. And so I could say a lot more. I think there's a lot more to say here, but I have my timer. And I am out of time. So I'm going to stop here and we can talk more about some specifics and some other, examples of this in the Q&A.
Thank you for inviting me to City College. I taught at CUNY for 20 years at Baruch College before I went to NYU and NYU Shanghai. I usually move between Shanghai and New York. This is my NYU year. Since I teach at NYU Shanghai, which it seems to be a link between US and China, I'll talk a little bit about my experience teaching there and looking at China from the bottom up rather than from the top down. I'm not a political scientist, I'm a historian. I went to China in my early teens. Arnie went in his late teens. I did my undergraduate and master's degree from China. I'm an Indian. I'll bring the Indian issue here. It's not just about China and US. For me, it's also about India and China, which, unlike US and China, actually went to war over a border in 1962. So it makes my status in China quite complicated, going between three nation states. And I teach a couple of courses that are relevant to the discussion here today. I'll say a little bit about NYU Shanghai. First, NYU Shanghai was set up about 10 years ago. We just celebrated our 10th year anniversary. 50% plus one student are Chinese. Rest are from all over the world, most of them from the US. It's an undergraduate teaching university developing its master's and PhD programs. But it's quite interesting to teach Chinese students about China. I do something called Global China, which is a very interesting field, and if you are interested, I can talk about what that field is. It is meant to demythologize China by looking at China not from inside out, but also outside in. But I teach two courses. One is called The Concept of China, which leaves most of the students very confused when I tell them the term China comes from India. But also there's problems with the Chinese term Zhongguo, which is the name of China in Chinese, and even the term Han, which is the name of the ethnic group, which was, it seems, given by so-called barbarians. The other course that I usually teach is called Tianxia, All Under Heaven. This is related to Ernie's point about empires. So teaching those two courses to a majority of Chinese students, very, very brilliant students, and I have the same courses here at NYU as well, so I get to see the two views. I had taught China at Baruch as well. Let me say 2 points. One, this idea of a civilizational state, right? This is different from the empire perhaps Ernie is talking about. Civilizational state is used both by India and China as a way of softening maybe the threat that each country poses. Although we are talking about China, if you ask, I don't know if there are people from Nepal, Bangladesh, or Pakistan here, in the region, India is a threat, the big brother, so-called. And this notion of civilizational state, India having 5,000 years of history, is very similar to what the Chinese would say. They have a 5,000 years of history of peaceful, harmonious interactions. The name that Raphael couldn't pronounce properly was Zheng He, who in the 15th century, early 15th century, went across the Indian Ocean 7 times. Quite amazing. Ships having perhaps the latest weaponry in the 15th century, including gunpowder-based cannons. And my argument with regard to him is that he was changing regimes in many different places in the Indian Ocean, which is not the symbol of harmony that the state, the Chinese state, promotes. But this notion of civilizational state has been used by both the nation states, India and China, which in many ways are converging in the ways in which they deal with its people. And we may blame China for surveillance, intellectual issues. Same is happening in India with the current government, and I don't think we are the largest democracy as they are said. But I think there are problems. But for me, the issue is not just US-China relations and where it's going to end up. I think the problem with China and India are more important these days, and the border issues that are coming up every year are quite important because that results in a wider geopolitical realignments. And I think given the situation within Asia, US is there, but if you have seen the newspapers, the other way in which India and China converge is with regard to the support to Russia in the Ukraine war. Both India and China are allying with Russia, it seems, despite the border issues. So what, in that sense, what does this civilizational state mean? It means nothing. unfortunately. It's just a notion in which they want to promote the view the others have outside India and China as we look towards these states which are in flux and having their own problems. So in order to understand China, I think it's one view is from looking at it from US perspective, and the other view is to look at it from the regional perspective within Asia, and India makes sense because there are various common issues, convergence, disputes, disconnections, and that gives a very different view about what people on the ground near China feel, which is quite different. China is still distant from the US. Bringing the US part here, NYU Shanghai actually plays a very important role in connecting, this might be part of your public diplomacy aspect, the Chinese students and foreign students stay with each other during their first year in the same dorm. And they interact with each other, taking courses that are quite controversial. I was in China in '89 when Tiananmen happened. I was in China when the lockdown happened in Shanghai. And then we get to talk about those issues. So it is one of the unique institutions where there's academic freedom on campus. And talking about the Tiananmen experience, because I was going there every year, brings about very interesting responses from Chinese students. And one part is nationalism. After Tiananmen incident happened in '89, the Chinese government changed its curriculum, school curriculum. Textbooks were changed to introduce something called the 100 Years of National Humiliation, which has resulted in development of nationalism among young people. One of the reactions among many young students is that whatever you see on CNN and BBC on Tiananmen is fake news, as somebody here in the US would say. But it's clearly very interesting as they look through other reporting of Tiananmen. They understand what they are getting as part of their textbooks, propaganda within the government. And then the students are quite bright in speaking up. I'll give you one example. When I was in NYU Shanghai, the Hong Kong protests took place. And we had a discussion on what was happening in Hong Kong. And the Chinese students were very much interested in figuring out how do we see the Hong Kong protest later on, 20 years from now. And one of the students asked, the Corbinists who were going against the Kuomintang in the 1940s are now seen as heroes. Is it possible the Hong Kong protesters will be in the future seen as heroes? Just asking that question is amazing, I think, in Shanghai. It cannot happen in other universities, I would say that. But these young students, and this is my second point about looking at China from bottom up, from the perspective of young Chinese, I think it matters a lot. And then here, my experience during the lockdown in Shanghai, I think revealed a number of things. It revealed two things for me. The Chinese state is not powerful. Every system in Shanghai broke down. Nobody knew who was in charge, the 2 months of lockdown. Was it the city government, the neighborhood committees, or who? Or where is the central government? And people started protesting and saying things about the government that then accumulated into the protest in December, which for me was quite amazing. I did not believe that Chinese students, young people, workers would go and protest and call for Xi Jinping to step down. That's quite brave, given all the surveillance there is. In China, everybody knew that that's going to take place. They were not afraid of saying those things. So what does that mean? How do we understand the next generation of the Chinese? And I would argue with that many of the propaganda that the Chinese government used to make, which was accepted through the textbooks, is falling apart. I think the whole notion of government propaganda, which is quite successful, pitting China against US. So this national humiliation is that foreigners were nasty towards China since the Opium War, and they are always a threat. They are going to humiliate us. That's the basic idea of nationalism teaching or discourse that has taken place. It's not only against US, it's also against Japan. And it became increasingly against India because of Dalai Lama and Tibet issues. But that seems to be collapsing. And this experience of what is happening post-COVID is very different from my experience post-Tiananmen. These two are very different cases, I would say. Post-Tiananmen, many of my classmates just forgot about Tiananmen, started making money, economy was rising. That's not the case in China today. Economy is not doing well. Unemployment is high. People are concerned about their livelihood. Will that matter? And I would argue that it would matter. And that's why instead of just looking at nation-state to nation-state relations, can we try to evaluate China from bottom up, from the perspective of the young people? And despite the restrictions on access to news sites, Chinese young people get news. They are aware of what's happening in the world. And I think given their post-COVID experience, they are questioning the state. How far that will go, we don't know. But everything begins with questioning. And that's starting now. Where it will go in the next 5 years will be quite interesting. How it will affect foreign relations, we do not know. But at least within the young people, they are questioning the place they live in. And in the future, we'll figure out. I'm going to return to China in August. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next year or so. But we have reached a stage where I think the fact that they believed that their state was really good and better than any other state in the world, they would show the images of parliaments, show the images of Trump and say how bad democracies are. Look at China, we are peaceful, quiet, harmonious. That has changed over the last 2 years, over the last year, I would say, with the COVID experiences. So we are in a different stage, domestically speaking, right? Will the Chinese government use the changed situation in the domestic issues to have a war with the US? Most likely, Taiwan is seen as an excuse to address the domestic uncertainties, perhaps. But I would say that in order to look at China, it is important to go beyond the nation-state framework and look at the people and think about what they believe they think China is. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am Abigail Copeland, and I am normally the person who doesn't do slides and yet find myself in the inverse of that today. Also, it is now going to be a little bit of a change of pace because I'm a sociologist, and I'm someone who's interested in questions like how science, regime legitimacy, and society co-evolve with each other, how the pursuit of high-tech development kind of changes how industry and the state and social actors fit together. And I do so through a relatively unusual way for someone who studies these topics. I'm an ethnographer. I live and work and do site visits and in-depth interviews in biotech companies and laboratories in China. Like the one that is in a very faded off picture here. But this, no, I faded it to be able to see the text. Yeah, but it's the China National Gene Bank, which is managed by a company called BGI. Has anyone ever heard of the company BGI? No one. Okay, a couple of people in the room. Larry, not unsurprisingly. But basically, it's the largest genomics company in the world. And it's also been in the American media, as I'm going to get to in a second, quite frequently. But anyhow, this approach that I take of doing ethnography gives me kind of a unique perspective because I see not only what the policies are on the books when it comes to science and technology, I see how actors on the ground, kind of as some of my co-panelists have talked about, are actually navigating them, how they're contending with the local ecosystem. And thus it's a really micro-level approach that I hope sheds some light not only on how Chinese domestic firms behave within the Chinese context, but also how we think about them as they become increasingly important international players. So if we look at the real politic of the situation, it is absolutely undeniable that there is the talk of decoupling and techno-nationalism and biotechnology and high-tech sectors generally are on the rise, both in Washington and in Beijing. In Washington, BGI, the firm I was just talking about, was added to the Department of Commerce's entity list, and specifically, actually, its academic research subsidiary in early March. We have numerous congressmen and senators calling for decoupling and from blocking Chinese firms from accessing the American ecosystem. Likewise, from the Biden administration, we are seeing a much more traditional kind of techno-nationalist industrial policy, calling for the creation of distinctly American technologies than we've seen in a long time. Similarly, on the Chinese side, we are seeing increasing calls for self-sufficiency and self-reliance technologically, and the inaction of a number of measures that are kind of limiting the export of technologies, limiting the export of data beyond China's borders. For example, this law in Chinese is the 2019 regulations on the management of human genetic resources. And yet, I work in this weird industry, or study this weird industry, in which this discourse of kind of increasing techno-nationalism and talk of decoupling doesn't quite reflect the reality of the ground. Biotech as an industry is intrinsically transnational. For one thing, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, the ecosystems are relatively complementary with one another. But even more so, what constitutes a Chinese versus an American company is actually much more difficult to disentangle than the common narrative would have you believe. So for example, we have companies like BeiGene, which is a biologics company. They make cancer drugs. But this is a company that's essentially been born global from the start. They have always had offices in both Beijing and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and have been looking to kind of leverage both ecosystems to further science. Moreover, the actual leadership of the company is reflects this dynamic in which it's hard to really say what exactly they are. It started by Wang Xiaodong, a Chinese-born researcher who then became a naturalized American citizen and since has returned to China, and John Euler, his American entrepreneurial and longtime friend, an American entrepreneur who is also his longtime friend. Moreover, it is just an industry in which there actually is a lot of mutual understanding and in which national identity functionally is not always super salient. These are people who did PhDs in fields like synthetic biology. They all know each other. They all went to grad school together. They continue to go on, to the same conferences, et cetera. I'd add that decoupling is also going to likely hurt the development of both industries if it is feasible and if it actually happens, and I'd be happy to talk more about why during the Q&A. But there is then a little bit of a puzzle here. Why, if it's not reflective of reality, are we continuing to see so much techno-nationalist discourse in both countries, but in China specifically? What does it actually do? In the current media and political landscape, we definitely, on the American side, are seeing this dynamic in which kind of nationalist statements by Chinese companies, national symbolism, is taken to be indicative of kind of the top-down development of science in China and indicative perhaps of state control of these companies. I want to complicate this a little bit. Specifically, I want to argue that nationalism in biotech and agrobiotech, and actually in a lot of China's high-tech sectors, is not so much a motivation or indicative of centralized state control, so much as it is a form of strategic action within the domestic space. Nationalism, it basically is something that people use to get what they want on the ground and to mitigate various conflicts of interest within the sector. Consequently, nationalism and ideas of kind of Chinese science as something that's distinct from its global counterparts ends up being a generative organizational logic that kind of structures each tier in the industry, like how the state and industry fit together, what these firms actually look like, people's individual career trajectories, ultimately even the technologies themselves. But what happens when these firms end up going global gets complicated. All of a sudden, these strategies that really help them domestically ends up with them being seen as very tainted and potentially nefarious actors as they go abroad. Anyhow, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but Basically, I argue, and again, I apologize, I'm giving a bit more of an academic talk than my co-panelist did, but basically arguing that this idea of biotechnology with Chinese characteristics operates under this principle of what I call technological domestication. Basically, the state, scientists, their entrepreneurial allies, they all use nationalism as a tool to align kind of the joint goals of governance, profit, and technological advancement, to mitigate conflicts of interest, to quell social anxieties around what are actually often really contentious technologies when we're talking about like gene editing and genetic testing in all of its forms. And to kind of construe genetic data as a national natural resource that is a necessary input for development. The idea here is that they're kind of structuring Chinese knowledge economy around a Chinese versus foreign dichotomy, and in so doing, they're blurring a lot of the other boundaries throughout society. That between the state and industry, academic, commercial spheres, and private and state-owned entities. This strategy has really catalyzed domestic industry, and yet, as I mentioned, is creating problems internationally. When you build Chinese knowledge economy along a Chinese versus foreign dichotomy, these firms have a really heavy incentive when they're acting domestically to try to distinguish themselves as like good Chinese nationalist firms. The problem is it actually doesn't have a lot to do with ownership, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with like where you're incorporated. It's to some degree like a moral identity that you have to repeatedly perform and kind of reestablish. And so consequently, all these firms operating in this ecosystem repeatedly engage in nationalist performances along different axes to kind of establish themselves as good Chinese actors. The symbolic, as you can see here, you pepper your website and the entry foyer of your company with pictures of Xi Jinping and other central level actors coming to visit your company with brass plaques announcing your participation in various kind of state science and technology development plans. The discursive in which you as a company, irrespective of what's actually motivating your action, you talk about what you do using state policies. You say, I am doing this because of the Belt and Road Initiative. I am doing this because of Healthy China 2030. Likewise, you perform technological kind of performances of nationalism in which you build technologies and produce science that is deliberately focused on the social, political, environmental, and economic needs of China as a state. I can talk more in the Q&A about that. And you kind of increasingly, basically there's a little bit of an attitude of talk is cheap. You have to step up and you have to actually do things. Saying you're, loyal is not enough. You have to step up and help the state solve various problems in normal times and in times of crisis. But when we get to these action-based displays of nationalism, which is really kind of what I want to focus on, what we see is that they're never actually just altruistic. It is always about kind of aligning economic interests with kind of these performative displays. This is an example at the bottom here. Again, can't really see, but that's okay. Basically BGI's first FireEye lab, which was in the crux of the January 2020 lockdown in Wuhan. The co-founder of BGI and his team went into the city and within a matter of days built this lab that could process 10,000 PCR samples in a day. And were celebrated as kind of major national champions for doing this. However, got it. It then becomes a product that they export throughout the world, and that has actually been a major revenue generator for the firm since. Real fast, in that I have 2 minutes here. Basically, this nationalist frame recuts, what does these nationalist performances actually do? It recuts boundaries between the state, society, and industry in ways that are actually immensely beneficial to these firms. BGI, for example, has founded a number of these kind of collaborative, multifaceted projects with localities around China that I won't get into, but center on genetic testing and specifically getting their non-invasive prenatal tests integrated into local healthcare schemes. And they then get the data. But my point being, basically within these schemes, the company and the local partners don't actually want the same thing. BGI wants data. They want market share. Their local partners want to get promoted. They want high-tech development. They want to, kind of high-tech solutions to long-term standing social problems. Each of these actors on the ground use nationalism as a means of kind of aligning their interests and mobilizing the population to participate. BGI is very keen to distance themselves from any kind of profit motive. To say like, actually, we're just an altruistic partner. We're here to support our local, our local official partners. Similarly, the local government is keen to show this, which is potentially, genetic testing is potentially a contentious technology here, as a form of paternalism, as a form of altruism, as a gift from state to society, and therefore get people to participate in kind of their, what ultimately is actually their surveillance of women's reproductive processes in various ways. But again, there's a real economic interest here. Basically, these collaborative agreements that you see on this map, when you sum them together, end up with a massive, systematic, stable, and immense biological data generation mechanism. That is really the core of BGI's ability to develop new technologies. It is the core of their revenue, et cetera. It is, not just a nationalist performance. It is actually deeply integral to their business model. And I will cut it off here by saying we see potentially, as we think about the global, a similar pattern in which nationalism definitely shapes how firms talk about their global expansion, but this does not necessarily mean that it's what's actually motivating it. How these firms are going to behave when they become embedded in other systems of political economy is actually a huge empirical question that we have to unpack. Moreover, I would just kind of articulate that this language definitely gets them in trouble when it comes to how they're seen globally. They're seen as a security risk by the American government, by governments globally, because of their potential ties to the state. And yet I would end with a call to say, as we understand China, we need to basically not do that and think about the fact that the state is different than firms, is different than the people, is different than all of these actors. We need to disaggregate and add some nuance to the conversation. Anyhow, thank you.
Thank you very much. Really fascinating presentations, a lot of food for thought. Can you hear me? I'll just put it closer. Yeah, fascinating presentations, a lot of food for thoughts. The point was really to bring different perspectives, and here I think we had really good examples of also the variety of research around China in the world and how you have transversal questions, that's working, including the question of nationalism, for instance, which is a thread along all these presentations. So we'll be quite quick because we want to open up the floor for Q&A. But we would start with like 2 questions. So please feel free to answer whoever would like to answer, and then we'll open up the floor. Shall I start with my question? Okay, I'd like to come back to the question of the risk of conflict and what you do with that. Arnie was saying it's not a Cold War, and yet that's the main framework where we're, which policy is using or increasingly using or the media is using. Naima, you're talking about the pessimism, and that's another kind of predominant framework. What kind of, what's the lesson for the policy world? Are there like alternative frameworks we can use? So the bottom-up approach is one of them, looking at empires, but we're still part of an academic debate. Are there ways to actually reframe policy debates, precisely to try to avoid a risk of escalation or conflict? And linked to that, it's more for the historians, a clash of empires doesn't look like very positive road either. Can we think of a possible accommodation in a case of conflict of empires? And can we shape, the ideology to, again, try to avoid conflict? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I can also add my questions to the list, and maybe we can go down the row in a bit, and then you can respond. So I think my questions goes off of, it's more directed towards Dr. Green-Riley's and Dr. Copland's presentations. So going off of the idea of public diplomacy engagement, it's something that I think we on principle all agree is important, right? In order to understand, in order to demystify China a little bit, and in order to promote a sense of cooperation on critical issues that face the world, we need to understand each other. And at a certain point, we also run up against perhaps certain value conflicts disagreements between the values that the U.S. holds compared to perhaps Chinese counterparts. So I think from your perspectives, from the perspective of a more citizen-level public diplomacy, what should we do when we encounter things like human rights issues, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan? What should individuals do in that case? And I think for Dr. Copeland, in the case of scientists and biotech companies working together, when they do come into these value conflicts over the use of genetic data, whether it's for surveillance of Uyghur populations in Xinjiang or for promoting, I guess, like pronatalist policies when it comes to non-invasive pregnancy testing. So what should we do as scientists in that case?
So we'll go down to the line?
Yeah, let's do that.
I'll start. I think that my answer to both of your questions is kind of similar, funnily enough, but it's only because I tend to focus so much on publics and the ways that popular discourse actually affect real, bilateral and multilateral diplomatic relationships. So clearly, the U.S.-China conflict, and this is China's relationship with every country in the world is one that should be sort of like of focus, because China's integrated into the entire world, just like the U.S. is integrated in the entire world. So I focus on U.S. and China, and I come to this question from a U.S. vantage point. But as my colleague pointed out, that's not the only way to think about what's happening in terms of China's role in the world. What I will say, though, is that I talked at the beginning of my remarks about this sense of antagonism or popular enmity that has seeped very much into civil society, into everyday sort of discourse about the country in the U.S. And also, I think is palpable when you're in China. I think that there's a sense of distrust that has transcended just sort of the policymakers and is within the popular sentiment as well. I think the big challenge for the future, but something that could mitigate the risk of conflict, is not just increased people-to-people exchanges or public diplomacy or something like that, but a way of being precise about the ways that we talk about China, or in China, the way that they talk about the United States, so that the areas that are conflictual are not overblown and not so overwhelming that we can't actually have a conversation with each other, right? And so sometimes when I listen to like congressional speeches about China, or I look at some of the legislation that's on the table right now about the U.S. relationship with China, I feel like well, I'll give an example. So there is this law that's being debated in Florida right now about who can buy property in Florida, and basically there's a lot of popular outcry, especially from Asian American communities, because the way that the law is worded basically implies that, and may actually not just imply, but have the effect of not allowing any Chinese national and any person who's not a permanent resident or a U.S. citizen who's actually domiciled in China would not be able to buy property in Florida. The way that lawmakers talk about that law in Florida that I'm seeing in the press is that they say they're preventing communist China from buying U.S. land or property. And so there's a lot of conflating that's happening, because anybody who's domiciled, right, in that country, a representative of communist China, I think that is like an overblowing, and the language is imprecise. And so that type of imprecision, I think, has led to an escalation of conflict between the two countries in ways that are problematic and dangerous. And so I think that the way to prevent conflict is to really promote, it's important for government and for policymakers to be talking to the private sector who's investing or collaborating with Chinese companies, and to be talking to members of civil society, be talking to people in the public. But let's be precise, and let's actually encourage people to understand issues more deeply so that they can understand, okay, well, here's a conflict, but is that conflict preventing any possibility of any kind of dialogue with this other country? Or is it something we need to hone in on, manage, but also then look at other aspects of as well, or look at things that we can agree more on as well.
I can go, and I might take these questions in somewhat of the inverse order in which they were asked, from kind of most specific to the broadest issue of kind of conflict. The first is, my first comment would be when it comes to kind of these cutting edge technologies that no one in the world is quite sure about what boundaries we want to set, and kind of, you know, how we want to regulate them. I think that conversation, like transnational conversation, is really important, but I think that we also have to understand that the goal can't be consensus. And I think that this is true in actually a lot of things in US-China relations, that knowing where each other stands might actually be the goal in and of itself, and that knowing is always better than not knowing. Again, I operate in a world with like gene editing and CRISPR and all of these crazy things that might fundamentally change what it is to be human. And so, you know, knowing where one another stand is good. The other thing that I would say that's quasi-related, though, is I think that we're in a moment in which we're seeing everything that goes on between the US and China through this like US-China relations lens. And that actually is a risk for characterizing things that are a function of an industry or a function of a particular facet of society as somehow being about US-China relations. And so actually, Larry, does specifically this issue of kind of non-invasive prenatal testing, one of the things that I meant to say in my presentation but got flustered and ran out of time, is that what's interesting is that, like, yes, BGI is, throughout the world, as this headline says, harvesting the genetic data of, you know, millions of women globally, but so is every other genetic testing company in the world. That is literally like the business model of direct-to-consumer testing, of clinical testing. It's give people genetic tests to build data sets. And yet when it's seen, when you refract it through this US-China tension, all of a sudden it becomes this characterized as intrinsically nefarious behavior that we need to be really worried about. Even though on this particular issue, they're actually quite in line with global practices. Similarly, we need to think seriously about, and this is directed definitely at politicians, about the risks of over-securitization. I think when you're working in politics, securitizing something is always the low-risk option, right? Like, I'm not going to get blowback if I, personally as a politician, if I say, like, we need greater regulation, we need, you know, to cut off, to decouple in this particular industry. And yet when you think in a longer term temporality beyond the next election, for example, there's actually often really deep ramifications for US-China relations, for scientific development, for all these things, and those get lost in the discussion. When it comes to, and this kind of escalates then to thinking about risk of conflict, I guess I kind of have 3 points. One is, I know this sounds naive, but people-to-people exchanges are actually really important to kind of promoting understanding. And not only things like the Fulbright program that got canceled, but also people-to-people exchanges in science, people-to-people exchanges in terms of companies. Like, when the governments aren't working, like, the other conduits that connect these two countries and do channel information are important. Likewise, and this is kind of apologies to anyone who's an IR specialist in the room, but we need a model other than great power relations to think about the US-China relationship. And we need to think about what we want the relationship to be, rather than perpetually being reactive and kind of saying, having both sides perpetually say, I don't like it when you do this, I don't like it when you do that. Like, we need to be more proactive and imagining what we want it to look at like, because neither the US nor China is going away anytime soon. So we need to contend with that reality.
I would agree with the criticism of the IR framework, not the scholars, but yeah, I think it has become a trend in IR things that I read to use history in a very different way than historians use, unfortunately. But I would like to say 2 things. One, with regard to conflict. Before the Ukraine thing, we feared that something is going to happen in Taiwan. That possibility seems to have gone down because of Russia's experience with Ukraine. But what has come up now is perhaps a smaller conflict that will take place in India with regard to Dalai Lama after he dies. And this place is called Taiwan, which is very important with regard to the reincarnation of Dalai Lama. And China claims that place. It's a small place in northeastern India. The issue is, what will India do, and will U.S. then step in? This was the same issue with Taiwan. Will the U.S. step in? And what the Chinese government has done with regard to the border between China and India is to gradually incorporate areas, not in big chunks, to see what the reaction of the Indian state would be. So far, it has not reacted with armed conflict. And the Indian military and the Indian foreign ministry disagree about how much inroads the Chinese army has made into Ladakh area, which is near Pakistan. So if there's going to be a conflict, it most likely in the near future would be between China and India rather than Taiwan. So I think the issue is what will happen then, right? And then China perhaps would like to see the reaction of the US when that happens. The second issue is with regard to nationalism, right? Nationalism in the biotech industry, I think you rightly pointed out, is being used for business profit purposes, all right? And I think that is the same with the Chinese students as well. Nationalism is used in a different way. And then nationalism, from my experience with Chinese students, is used by the Chinese students who are at NYU more than those who are at NYU Shanghai. So the Chinese students who come through the Chinese system to NYU Shanghai have a very different perspective on nationalism than the Chinese students here who have come to the US to do high school and then get into NYU. So we should not lump all these young Chinese students together, because their views and use of nationalism is quite different, and we understand why in the US they would resort to nationalism because of the anti-Asian things that they have dealt with, right? So it has to do with their own personal experience that they think that we should be seen as Chinese and China is a great power. So I think that experience really matters for the Chinese students who have spent their high school years in the US or Canada and now at NYU. Thank you.
So I think it's really important to understand that this conflict is not a misunderstanding. I mean, there isn't anything, at least short term, that anyone can do by wishing the conflict to go away or believing that if we understand each other's motives better, that relations between the United States and China would somehow miraculously revive. I don't believe that for a minute. And I think it's dangerous to believe that. Again, if we use historical examples, that's exactly when really bad things happen, right? When people think that by, in a very superficial kind of way, accommodating the way they think others see the world, that conflict will go away. They usually don't, unfortunately. So I think there are some relatively simple answers, though, but they are almost impossible to implement. That are there in terms of the situation that we have now. Two things. United States need to accommodate China's rise. China will continue to rise even if this government that it has now will get into trouble. And I have a deep suspicion it will get into trouble at some point reasonably soon. That won't, as Tansen said, this won't make China go away, right? Or the Chinese challenge to US hegemony to go away. And by accommodating, I mean both in terms of overall approaches in international organizations and institutions, in terms of trade, in terms of a whole set of bilateral issues that are there. But I'm also thinking in hard power terms. I mean, I think we are now moving into, after this past week, moving into a territory where I think it's quite possible that China will end up, at least on one side, almost dictating a kind of ceasefire in Ukraine. It won't happen immediately, but I think the potential for that happening is actually fairly large, which will be the first time that China has taken on that kind of international role, the kind of role that the United States would normally have in international affairs. And I think it will be really important to see if the United States can live with that, which would be a step, in my view, in the right direction, which is not the same thing as saying that I would necessarily agree with individually, personally, accept what the Chinese come up with regard to Ukraine. I'm deeply suspicious of where that could actually lead. But that is the relationship, in terms of how it is. And then secondly, China needs to avoid antagonizing its neighbors, which is probably even worse, in terms of the potential for this happening. Because China seems at the moment to be hell-bent under the current leadership to do exactly that. All the way down. I mean, from Japan and Korea all the way around the coast to India and to Central Asia, for that matter. Right? And the reason why China mustn't do that is that that's the way wars break out. Right? That's the way really, really bad things happen. This was the case with the two world wars. It was the case with the wars in the 19th century. It is what happens around the borders of the rising power. Think Germany prior to 1914. That would lead to some kind of military conflict breaking out. Is it likely that we can prevent China, or Chinese people more importantly, can prevent China from doing that? I'm not so sure. But that is what needs to happen. So both things have to happen. I mean, the United States must understand that China is rising and probably will continue to rise, and make some really hard choices as a result of that. And China needs to avoid, as it rises, to get into some kind of existential conflict with not just the United States, but much of the rest of the world over its intent to control its region. Those, I think, that's where we need to go. And I really hope we can get there, but at the moment I'm not very optimistic.
Yeah, just along that line is what is China trying to accomplish, all right? And this has to do with the Chinese world order that they want to create. This is part of the Tianxia, an alternative to the US world order. And if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, having economic incentives given to many countries, or whatever the criticism is, Africa has a very positive view on China, 75% positive view on China. Why, right? And then what they have been doing, the Chinese government in particular, creating this order that would say, there is an alternative to what the Americans and the Western powers have done in the past. And some states have bought into that, right? They agree with that. And it's not just Africa, Sri Lanka, Pakistan is always there, right? So there is this way that, do you want a different global South world order, right? Instead of a global North world order. And they are quite successful with many countries, right? So maybe not with India, maybe not with the US, but some countries have bought in. Economy really matters, right? I mean, it's beyond the companies. States are also concerned about their bottom lines. So they are supporting that creation of the Chinese world order. And what Ernie said, will US live with that alternative world order or not, is a question.
Thank you so much for those responses. I think we're running a little bit short on time, but I think we can probably do a quick round of questions from the audience members. So if you have a question, we have a microphone. So raise your hands. We'll do a quick collection of questions, and then we'll do a rapid fire response from our panelists over here. All right, see some hands over there. There's two hands in front too. There's a mic coming towards you. Yeah.
My name is Irving Lee. I'm not a student. I'm in my 60s actually, but I have a question in terms of an analysis on the basis of the confrontation between the United States and China. I think it's underdeveloped in this talk. Of course, you have so much time, right? But it's clear to me that the nations around the world see China as an alternative development. The recent signing of the peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is contrast to the U.S., or more specifically, the British model of development, which is what the United States has adopted since World War II. And I think that should be understood as the confrontation. It's the model of development.
Yeah, I think there's also a hand right next to you. Why don't we collect a few questions and then we'll bring it back to the panelists. Right next to. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Hassan.
Yeah.
Ask your question.
Yeah, you had a
yeah,
question, right?
When we talk about decoupling from China and biotechnology at the same time, I think of the Chips and Science Act that was passed under the Biden administration of last year in March, I believe. And so there's just been like recent move in trying to get manufacturing away from China and towards like domestic markets in the U.S. How does this situation affect the world of biotechnology and also relations with China, the U.S., and Taiwan? Because, you know, Taiwan manufactures the most semiconductors.
Wonderful. And I think I saw one last hand, so maybe a short question from the gentleman over there.
I have a question. We don't live in a unipolar world order, and we see that we are coming to multipolar order. And then I would like to ask you the question, how will you reconcile the Western hegemony or ideology and the Chinese new perspective of changing the international world order?
Wonderful. I think we'll cap that at, there's one more question from Juan. Up front here. You're good? Okay. All right, so why don't we turn it back to the panelists, if any of you want to respond to any of the questions put on the table.
Okay, specific question to me on biotech. Yeah, so it's actually a multifaceted answer. One is my colleagues who work on the semiconductor industry would first point out that actually a number of the specific policy measures in the CHIPS Act were specifically meant to hold back China's biotech capacity as much as semiconductor capacity in terms of which chips were blocked. You're seeing decoupling in biotech in kind of a passive-aggressive way, as that kind of exemplifies. No one really wants to say, let's fully decouple an industry that's about feeding people and curing cancer, but both sides are a little bit leery of each other. But the problem with that I would ever so briefly say is that not all industries follow the same model as semiconductors. And biotech, for example, is one in which there's not a significant first mover advantage as there is in semiconductors. It's more of an academic kind of competition where like you want to stay up with your competitors. You know, you sit on a panel with them and you like ask them for coffee afterwards and exchange a couple of postdocs. And so by decoupling, by kind of taking this model of let's take our toys and go home, you're actually potentially killing the competitiveness of the American biotech industry as much as you are, quote, protecting it. I leave the bigger questions to my co-panelists.
I think the Western hegemony is exactly the narrative the Chinese are using. As you know, most of the global South was colonized by the West, and it fits into that narrative quite well. What did the West bring to you during the colonial period? We did not do that, right? And then we bring you lots of money and enjoy the Chinese benefits. So the Western hegemony is a narrative that the Chinese are using it quite well. And it's not just a state. The problem with China now is that Chinese intellectuals have bought into that. And in their publications, they are also using that same narrative. And so what has happened is the Chinese state and many of the Chinese intellectuals have become so much entwined that you can't differentiate between the state propaganda and academic writings on critique of Western hegemony.
How about Indian British imperialism?
Yeah, same. And so that India always tries to compete with China with that regard, but India's critique of colonialism is not the same as the Chinese critique of colonialism. Many Indians, especially us Bengalis, think of a colonial with nostalgia rather than with criticism. So Indian experience with the British colonialism is quite different from what happened with the Opium Wars in the Chinese. So not all colonialism is the same.
How about the Bengali famine?
Famine, yeah, we have forgotten that. Yeah.
All right. Nemo, Arnie?
I'll just say quickly, this. It's funny because I think the first questioner, you made a comment about the basis of the confrontation between the U.S. and China and whether it's a model of development that's the basis of the confrontation. And I think that relates to the third question. I think he left. But I don't know that I would necessarily say it's the model of development. I think it's the entire model of what it means to be the most powerful or one of the most powerful countries in the world, right? So that is partially a development model, partially an idea of what it means to be, to govern, what it means to have access to coercive capability, what it means to have a very strong economy, what it means to manage information. I think that all of those are caught up in the confrontation, and so development is certainly a part of it. In the current era in which there is a contest of these models, I think that what China has offered to the world is an alternative to what we've seen since World War II, right? So U.S. leadership, U.S. hegemony in the world. And what's interesting and what's part of the conversation that was just taking place is that part of that appeal actually, I think, is designed to attract people who might be tired of that form of leadership, that post-World War II leadership style, or that arrangement of world order, for a lot of different reasons. It might have to do with their experiences with colonialism. It might have to do with their experiences with, still being developing and dealing with trying to address their own struggles and not feeling like Western powers in the United States were helpful in that endeavor. And so I think that what will be crucial is actually the responses of the global South, the responses of those different nations to China, and the extent to which they feel like they buy into this Chinese ideology, but like when it actually comes to the actual, like when it's playing out, not just the idea of the BRI, but when the BRI happens, are people enjoying, the projects that are offered? When the partnerships happen or the diplomatic deals happen, is that leading to a model that then they feel included in? That's what I'll say.
Just briefly in conclusion, I think one has to be very careful with postulating that China necessarily, in a sort of comprehensive form, has an alternative form of development to what we have seen so far. I mean, the British and then the American takeover. What I've seen in more than 40 years now of living in and out of China is a cruder, rawer form of capitalism with much fewer restrictions, much worse situation in terms of protections for the working class than what we arrived at very late in the Western forms of that economic system. Of course, it's mixed with authoritarian government, which probably makes the exploitation worse in many ways. But those who believe that because China is, I think, de facto a part of the global South, could even possibly, with a little bit of a stretch of the imagination, be characterized as post-colonial, that it, as a result of that, has arrived at a better form of governance for ordinary people, or an economic system that's less exploitative than what we see in the West. That is not my impression. So I think one has to be very careful here about thinking about two things at the same time, right? So it is possible for a country like China to rise back towards, as Tansen pointed out, the historical mean, right? I mean, China has always, in its imperial form, been a big and powerful country. But without that necessarily meaning that China has something to offer to the rest of the world that is some kind of model that people should embrace, right? These two are not necessarily going well together. There is a deep element of tragedy in that. I would have wished that the world would have had a much better economic and social system than what we now see practiced in the West. But I'm not sure that China, certainly not under its current regime, is that.
Wonderful. I think to close things off, we have our colleague Dirk Moses, who's a professor at the Political Science Department, and the Anna Bernard Spitzer Chair in International Relations, to say a few words for us.
Thanks very much, Larry. So it falls upon me to wind things up, but as you can see, we're only just getting going. The discussion was really becoming more fine-tuned, more forensic, more fine-grained. We really need hours, but it gets us going. We have 3 classes here. So there's a lot on the table for us to discuss with our students in the next couple of weeks. You've given us an embarrassment of riches. We're deeply grateful that you've come to New York from up north and down south. And we look forward to further informal discussions in the course of the day. And with that, we express our thanks with a hearty round of applause.